Right, Henry Jekyll's full statement of the case, this last chapter is what we're going to look at. We're going to look at the key quotes in this chapter now, quite briefly, because I'm just going to read through the quotes with you and get you to think about them yourselves. It's your personal response that really counts in any answer, but I think it's certainly worth me pointing out some of the kind of key points here. Page 42, about 5 sentences in, Henry Jekyll talks about his early life and talks about his dual nature. In other words, he has two sides to him. It's always been there. It's not like he suddenly became Jekyll and Hyde. There was something within him, there's something about him that had two sides to him. Many a man would have even emblazoned such irregularities as I was guilty of. So he's talking about his profound duplicity of life. He in the previous sentence, and duplicity means double dealing or two-facedness. If you're duplicitous, you're two-faced, and so there's something always two-faced about Jekyll. Many a man would have even emblazoned such irregularities as I was guilty of, but from the high views that I had set before me, I regarded and hid them with an almost morbid sense of shame. It was thus rather the exacting nature of my aspirations than any particular degradation in my faults that made me what I was, and, with an even deeper trench than in the majority of men, severed in me those provinces of good and ill which divide and compound man's dual nature. So he's saying that man has two sides to him, the good and the bad. And that what was key with Jekyll was he had exacting nature of my aspirations. He had these very, very high ambitions to be a very important and august and respectable man. He wanted, in other words, to live the life of the respectable Victorian gentleman, Victorian doctor, and it was this desire to appear respectable rather than any particular degradation in my faults, and rather than shocking kind of sinfulness in his behaviour that was it. So in other words, what Stevenson's doing here is very interesting. He's sort of saying that it's the society almost that created Jekyll and Hyde, because this is a society which demands that you are respectable if you're going to have a high place in it, and yet that is at a cost of ignoring your perhaps deeper, perhaps baser desires. Stevenson further explores this here when he talks about becoming Edward Hyde, top of page 44. Then these agonies began to swiftly subside, and I came to myself as if out of a great sickness. There was something strange in my sensations, something indescribably new, and from its very novelty incredibly sweet. I felt younger, lighter, happier in body. Within, I was conscious of a heady recklessness, of a current of disordered sensual images running like a mill in my fancy, a solution of the bonds of obligation, an unknown but not an innocent freedom of the soul. I knew myself, at the very first breath of this new life, to be more wicked, tenfold more wicked, sold a slave to my original evil, and the thought in that moment braced and delighted me like wine. So he becomes Edward Hyde, and he loves it. It is incredibly sweet to him. He feels much happier in his body, younger, lighter, happier. He's full of this recklessness. So in other words, he's not going to think about things. If you're reckless, you don't think about what your actions at all. Disordered sensual images. That's a reference to the sort of sexual aspect of Hyde that's explored in the films, not only lightly touched upon in the book, isn't it? We don't see Hyde with any particularly disreputable people, but we get a sense that this is probably what he's up to. a solution to the bonds of obligation. So that means a disappearance of feeling that you have to do your duty. So in other words, he doesn't feel obliged to behave in any way. He can behave exactly how he wants to. And he has an innocent freedom of the soul. So in other words, he feels free. This is vital in this book to remember. It isn't a solution that changes Jekyll. That's the point. The solution doesn't suddenly make him into a bad person. He always was this person deep down, and the solution just allows him to change into a person that gives him a good disguise that allows him to be like this. So he's sold a slave to my original evil. So this is original evil. He always felt like he wanted to do these things, trample on people, on young girls, and murder old men, and I'm no doubt go and behave in a sexual manner with women, or whatever he gets up to. We're not told. Jekyll is Hyde, and this is the bottom of page 44. We get more of a sense of this. The about 4 or 5 sentences from the bottom. And yet, when I looked upon that ugly idol in my glass, I was conscious of no repugnance, rather a leap of welcome. This too was myself. It seemed natural and human. So Hyde is him, he isn't disgusted by Hyde. In fact, he revels and loves the disguise of Hyde. Hyde is just a disguise. Page 45, the last paragraph, second sentence. I would still be merrily disposed at times, and as my pleasures were, to say the least, undignified, and I was not only well known and highly considered, but growing towards the elderly man, this incoherency of my life was daily growing more unwelcome. It was on this side that my new power tempted me until I fell into slavery. I had but to drink the cup, to doff at once the body of a noted professor, and to assume, like a thick cloak, that of Hyde. I smiled at the notion. It seemed to me at the time to be humorous, and I made preparations with most studious care. I took and furnished that house in Soho to which Hyde was tracked by the police, and engaged a housekeeper, a creature whom I well knew to be silent and unscrupulous. So, again, this is someone, Jekyll looks after Hyde and arranges for him to live this double life. And it prompts a question, what would you do if you could get away with it? This is what this book prompts. And I think this last section is interesting because the mystery has been solved, but now we're learning the psychological reasons why Jekyll did this. Bottom page 46. There's do a cross-reference with page 4 and the child being trampled upon. An act of cruelty to a child aroused against me the anger of passer-by, whom I recognised the other day in the person of your kinsman. The doctor and child's family joined him. There were moments when I feared for my life, and at last, in order to pacify their too just resentment, Edward Hyde had to bring them to door and pay them with a cheque in the name of Henry Jekyll. Notice how brief. An act of cruelty to a child. Well, he doesn't say, I trampled upon the child in the most horrific way, like a juggernaut. Does he? He doesn't linger long. He doesn't like to think about it. It's almost a sort of throwaway remark, isn't it? It gives an insight into why Hyde and Jekyll, Jekyll was doing this. He doesn't think about the consequence. He seems to have no real sense of remorse at all. Then we find that he, after the murder of Sedanvers, which he was not very happy about, he finds that he's having great difficulty controlling Edward Hyde. second paragraph, last few sentences of page 47. Now, the hand of Henry Jekyll, as you have often remarked, was professional in shape and size. It was large, firm, white and comely. But the hand which I now saw clearly enough in the yellow light of a mid-London morning, lying half shut on the bedclothes, was lean, corded, knuckly, of dusky pallor, and thickly shaded with a swart of growth of hair. It was the hand of Edward Hyde. Notice we have interesting sentence structure here. We have the very long sentence full of commas, building up a sense of atmosphere, the yellow light of the mid-London morning, the this man lying half shut on the bedclothes, and then the adjectives: lean, comma, corded, comma, knuckly, comma, of dusky pallor, using the commas to build up a sense of this rather disgusting and vile hand, all hairy and knuckly and unpleasant. And then that very short sentence, it was the hand of Edward Hyde, which emphasises how he is turning into Hyde, and he's not much that he can do about it. He's losing control. His monster is taking over him. His creation is taking over him. When she says in the next paragraph, "Yes, I had gone to bed, Henry Jekyll. I had awakened Edward Hyde." How was this to be explained, I asked myself, and then, with another bound of terror, how was it to be remedied? So he's now dealing with the fact that Hyde is taking over. Page 48 now. That part of me which I had the power of projecting had lately been much exercised and nourished. It seemed to me as of late as though the body of Edward Hyde had grown in stature, as though when I wore that form I were conscious of a more generous tide of blood, and I began to spy a danger that, if this was much prolonged, the balance of my nature would be permanently overthrown, the power of voluntary change forfeited, and the character of Edward Hyde become irrevocably mine. So he's worried that Edward Hyde is dominating, and of course he's dominating because Edward Hyde is him, and all the drug does is sort of drops his inhibitions, doesn't it? Stops him from being repressed. And I suppose you could argue that this whole section is about the ways in which Jekyll has repressed or held back his true desires, and that Hyde is a way that he can articulate or be what he really wants to be. The next paragraph of 48 is very interesting. Second sentence: Jekyll, who was composite, now with the most sensitive apprehensions, now with greedy gusto, projected and shared in the pleasures and adventures of Hyde, but Hyde was indifferent to Jekyll, or but remembered him as a mountain bandit remembers the cavern in which he conceals himself from pursuit. Jekyll had more than a father's interest. Hyde had more than a son's indifference. So, this is a really interesting passage to look at. Jekyll had enjoyed the thoughts of all of Hyde's adventures. So Jekyll was like what we call a voyeur, V-O-Y-E-U-R, a voyeur, which means someone who sort of spies and gets pleasure out of spying, usually often on with sexual activity. So Jekyll has been a voyeur, looking at what Hyde is doing and enjoying it. Hyde, though, couldn't really care less, because he's indifferent to Jekyll or Hyde. And then there's an interesting simile here: as a mountain bandit remembers the cavern in which he conceals himself. So Hyde is the person who's alive, like a bandit, having a great time, stealing things, behaving despicably, and Jekyll is like a cavern or a cave that just holds him. So Jekyll essentially has no character, does he? He's just a set of behaviours that the society has suggested he behaves as. So Victorian society is set up, these respectable people, you should do this and that, you should live in this house, behave in this way, but that doesn't allow one to express oneself or to be oneself. Certainly not for Jekyll. Page 49. For 2 months, however, he decides to live exactly like Edward Hyde, like Henry Jekyll, and that means that he becomes, on page 49, the first paragraph, last sentence, I began to be tortured with throes and longings, as of Hyde struggling after freedom. And at last, in an hour of moral weakness, I once again compounded and swallowed the transforming draught. So he swallows the drug again. Okay, I want you to listen to the next section where I explore the last section of this book. But I want you to think particularly over the last few pages we've looked at and think about what does this tell us about the character of Jekyll, this beginning section of his full testament and confession, and how is Stevenson keeping the reader's interest here?